The day they pinned a notice to the door of Grace Merriweather's veterinary practice in Dusty Creek, Colorado, was the day she decided she would never again let a man's fear determine the shape of her life. It was the spring of 1882, and Dusty Creek sat at the edge of the San Juan Mountains like a stubborn splinter that the wilderness had never quite managed to push out. The town had a livery, a general store, a saloon that smelled of cedar smoke and spilled whiskey, a small church with a crooked steeple, and enough pride to fill a river that had long since run dry. The people who lived there were hardworking and weathered, the kind who did not cry easily but who could tell you the exact weight of a sorrow they had carried for 20 years. Grace had come to Dusty Creek 3 years before, in the spring of 1879, when she was 24 years old, carrying 2 leather bags, a doctor's case that had belonged to her father, and a certificate from the Colorado Agricultural College that said she had completed her studies in veterinary medicine. She was, by every honest measure, the most qualified practitioner of animal medicine within 60 miles in any direction. She could diagnose a lung infection in a horse before the animal had started coughing. She could set a broken leg on a calf so cleanly that it grew up to run as fast as any other in the herd. She had once, in the dead of a January blizzard, reached into a mare in distress and turned a foal that would have killed them both, and she had done it with nothing but lamplight and her own steady hands. The ranchers had accepted her at first out of desperation. The previous town veterinarian, a man named Dr. Fulton, had left for Denver the year before Grace arrived, and there was no one else. Cattle were getting sick. Horses were going lame. When Grace walked into the livery that first spring afternoon and offered her services, the stableman, a barrel-chested fellow named Hank Dubrow, had looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. But she had saved his prize draft horse from a tetanus infection within a week, and Hank had told every man in the county. For 3 years she had built a life in Dusty Creek. She had a small office on the eastern edge of town, a house attached to the back of it with a garden where she grew herbs she used in her treatments. She kept a chestnut mare named Coppice, who was smarter than most people she knew. She had earned the trust of the ranchers, the farmers, the small homesteaders trying to carve something real out of the rocky Colorado earth. Then the Cattlemen's Association had decided she was a problem. The notice on her door that April morning in 1882 read in blunt black ink, "By order of the Dusty Creek Cattlemen's Association, the practice of veterinary medicine within the county limits shall be restricted to licensed practitioners of sound professional standing. Inquiries regarding Miss Merriweather's standing are under review. Ranchers are advised to seek counsel before engaging her services." She read it twice. Then she took it off the door with a single clean pull, walked inside, set it on her table, and looked at it for a long time. The word they had used was standing. It was a careful word, chosen deliberately. It did not say she was incompetent. It did not say she had made errors. It said her standing was under review, which meant nothing and everything at the same time. It was the kind of language men used when they could not find a real fault and so invented the shape of one instead. She knew who was behind it. There were 3 men who ran the Cattlemen's Association in practice, whatever the membership rolls said. Bernard Hollies owned the largest cattle operation in the county, 7,000 acres running north toward the mountains. He was 53, red-faced, and he had never once spoken to a woman about business without a look on his face that suggested she had wandered into the wrong room. Thomas Prout owned the second largest spread and was Bernard's close friend, a quieter man but one who agreed with everything Bernard said and added the weight of his silence to it. And then there was Congressman-elect Wendell Hare, who had recently won his seat in the Colorado State Legislature and who had made no secret of his belief that women working in professional trades was a symptom of civilization in decline. Wendell Hare had 2 sick horses. Grace had looked at them the previous month and told him they had a liver condition that would worsen without specific treatment. He had thanked her coldly. Then he had brought in a man from Denver named Dr. Silas Pratt, who had looked at the same horses and told Hare they were perfectly fine. When one of the horses died 2 weeks later, Hare had not blamed Dr. Pratt. He had instead turned his anger sideways and aimed it at Grace, because the truth was harder to live with than the lie. That was the spring of 1882. Grace set the notice on her table and went to work. She had 4 appointments that morning, including a rancher named Cal Whitmore whose young heifers had been dropping calves early. She treated all 4 patients with the same careful precision she always used. She did not mention the notice to anyone. She went home that evening, cooked herself a meal, sat by the window with her father's medical journals, and tried to feel less like the ground beneath her feet was becoming uncertain. Her father, Jonas Merriweather, had been a physician in Pennsylvania who had believed completely in Grace's intelligence and had taught her everything he knew about medicine and observation and the steady logic of living things. He had died when she was 20, which was why she had gone west rather than staying in the comfortable east where the rules were older and more fixed. She had thought the west would be freer, and in many ways it had been. But freedom on the frontier was a complicated thing. It existed in the space between rules, and the men who made the rules could close that space whenever they decided to. 2 days after the notice appeared, she lost her first client. Cal Whitmore came to her door with his hat in his hands and told her he was sorry, but he had been told at the feed store by Bernard Hollis himself that any rancher using her services would find their cattle loans called in at the bank, which Hollis partly owned through a board position. "I'm sorry, Grace," Cal said, and he genuinely was. His eyes showed it. "I got 3 kids and a mortgage. I can't fight that man." "I know," she said. "I don't blame you, Cal." She meant it. She was furious, but not at Cal Whitmore. By the end of the first week, she had lost 6 of her 12 regular ranch clients. The homesteaders were smaller accounts, and some of them stayed with her because they were not in debt to Hollis's bank. But the money from homesteaders with 1 or 2 animals barely covered the cost of her supplies. She wrote 3 letters to the Cattlemen's Association requesting a formal hearing on the review of her standing, and all 3 were ignored. She considered leaving. She sat with the idea one evening, turning it over honestly, because she believed in being honest with herself even when it was uncomfortable. She could go to Denver. She could go further west. She could find another small town, start again, and perhaps avoid drawing the attention of men who felt threatened by her skill. But there was something in her that would not move. It was not stubbornness for its own sake. It was something more like principle, the quiet, immovable kind. She had built something real here. She had helped animals and the people who depended on them. She had earned her place not through charm or connection, but through the quality of her work. The idea of giving that away to men who had manufactured a reason to take it felt like agreeing with them, and she would not agree with them. So she stayed. Chester Crawford arrived in Dusty Creek on a Tuesday morning in late April, 3 weeks after the notice appeared on Grace's door. He rode in on a buckskin horse that had a long, easy stride and the look of an animal that had covered serious distance without complaint. Chester himself was 31, with broad shoulders and the kind of steady posture that came not from performance, but from a life spent outdoors with things that required his attention. He had dark hair that was a little long under his hat, a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and eyes that were a clear, particular shade of brown that seemed to take in a great deal while giving away very little. He came from New Mexico originally, had worked cattle drives up the Goodnight-Loving Trail twice in his 20s, and for the past 4 years had been working as a livestock assessor for the Territorial Land and Cattle Commission, a position that had taken him across Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico, assessing the health and value of cattle herds for estate settlements, bank loans, and land transactions. He was respected at his work, methodical and fair. He had a reputation for being difficult to bully, which was an asset in a job that put him regularly in the presence of men who had a great deal riding on his assessments. He had been sent to Dusty Creek to assess the Hollies herd as part of a loan collateralization for a large expansion Hollies was planning. It was routine work, or it was supposed to be. Chester checked into the Dusty Creek Hotel on that Tuesday morning, left his horse at the livery with Hank Dubrow, and spent the first hour of his day walking the town because he always walked a new place before he started working in it. He was reading the texture of a place, the way things sat, the mood and the spaces between buildings. He noticed the veterinary practice on the east end of town because the sign was well made, and the garden beside the building was clearly tended by someone who knew what they were doing. He noticed it also because there was a woman in the garden, kneeling in the dirt beside a row of low green plants, entirely focused on what she was doing, wearing practical clothes and work gloves, her dark auburn hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat. He would have kept walking, except that at that moment a boy came sprinting down the road from the direction of the northern farms, nearly losing his shoes on the dusty ground, and shouted, "Miss Merriweather! Miss Merriweather!" "Jake Prentice's mare is down. She's been down since last night. Jake says please can you come?" The woman in the garden stood up from her kneeling position in a single fluid movement, pulled off her gloves and said, "Tell him I'm on my way." She went into the building without rushing but also without any wasted motion. 3 minutes later she came back out with her medical case, went to the small stable behind the building, emerged with a saddled chestnut mare, and was gone down the road at a canter before the boy had finished catching his breath. Chester watched all of that without moving from the boardwalk. He turned to an older man sitting in a chair nearby, whittling something that might eventually become a bird. "That the town veterinarian?" The old man looked at him sideways. "That's Grace Merriweather, and yes, she is. Best animal doctor in the county, whether certain people want to admit it or not." Chester noted the tone in that last sentence. "Is there a disagreement about that?" The old man gave a short, dry laugh. "There's a disagreement about everything in this town if Bernard Hollies decides there ought to be." Chester filed that away and went to see about his work. He spent that afternoon at the Hollies ranch, walking the herd with Bernard Hollies and the ranch foreman, a quiet, competent man named Doug Earl. The cattle were in reasonable condition, though Chester noted several animals that showed early signs of a respiratory issue that would need attention. He made his notes carefully and said nothing aloud about his concerns yet, because his assessments were formal documents and he did not make partial announcements. Bernard Hollies was the kind of man who filled a room with his own certainty, the way some fires fill a room with smoke before warmth. He shook Chester's hand with the particular aggressive firmness of a man who wants to establish the pecking order in the first 5 seconds. He talked through the tour in a continuous stream that left little room for questions, which Chester suspected was deliberate. At the end of the afternoon, as Chester was preparing to ride back to town, Hollies said, "I expect you'll find everything in order. I run a tight operation." "I'll have a formal assessment ready in about a week," Chester said pleasantly. "I like to be thorough," Hollies nodded, but something tightened slightly around his eyes. "Of course. And while you're in town, I'd advise against spending much time with certain individuals who have been causing trouble for the legitimate business community. I'm sure you understand." Chester looked at him for a moment without expression. "I appreciate the advice," he said, and rode away. He did not appreciate the advice. He noted it. The following morning Chester was at the livery early to check on his buckskin, a horse he had owned for 6 years and treated more carefully than he treated most things in his life, when he heard voices from the adjacent stall. He recognized Grace Merriweather's voice because it had a particular quality of calm authority, though it was lower now, quieter, speaking to an animal. He looked over the partition. She was with a young bay horse, a 2-year-old by the look of it, that was trembling and sweating and showing the whites of its eyes. She was standing close to it with one hand flat against its neck, speaking very quietly, and in her other hand she held a small syringe. "Easy," she said, not loudly. "Easy, there you are, I have you. This is going to feel cool for a moment, and then the pain is going to start pulling back. I promise you that." The horse, which had been shaking hard, stilled by degrees under her hand. She administered the injection with a smooth, practiced motion that the horse barely seemed to notice, and then she kept her hand on its neck and kept talking softly until the trembling stopped entirely. Chester had spent his life around horses and the people who worked with them. He had seen competence and he had seen care, and the best of it was usually when those two things occurred together in the same person. He watched for a little longer than was probably polite before he stepped back. He was at the livery door when she came out behind him, case in hand, and nearly walked into him. She took a quick step back. Her eyes, which were gray and direct, assessed him in a second. "I apologize, I didn't hear you there." "My fault," he said, and meant it. "Chester Crawford, I arrived yesterday." "I know," she said. "Dusty Creek is small." She did not seem hostile, but she was not opening any doors either. Her expression was the kind of polite neutrality that people develop when they have learned to take strangers as given information rather than assumptions. "That horse in there," he said, because he could not help himself. "What did you give it?" She looked at him with slightly more interest. "A tincture of belladonna, very diluted. He had colic from a feed change and the muscle spasms were getting severe. The belladonna relaxes the intestinal cramping. He needs to be walked in a half-hour and watched through the night, but he should be fine." Chester nodded slowly. "Hank said to keep him still." "Hank means well," she said, without any cruelty. "But stillness is the worst thing for colic. Movement encourages the gut to resolve the blockage. I'll leave instructions." He looked at her for another moment. He was aware that he was perhaps looking longer than was standard, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the particular way of a person so entirely at home in what they do that it becomes a kind of beauty, but because he was trying to understand the thing he had heard in the old man's words the day before. "Can I buy you coffee?" he said. "I'm new here and I find I always understand a place better when I've talked to someone who actually works in it." She looked at him with a careful, measuring quality. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Crawford?" "Livestock assessment. I'm here to assess the Hollies herd." Her expression did not visibly change, but something in it did shift, like the surface of water when something moves below it. "I see," she said. Then, after a pause, "I have a morning round. If you're at Donahue's around noon, I can spare half an hour." "That's fine," he said. "Thank you." She walked away down the road with her case, and he watched her go, and he thought that there was something in the set of her shoulders, something that was both determined and tired, and he found he wanted to understand what had put it there. They met at Donahue's, which was the town's small restaurant and not the saloon, and Grace arrived at noon with the punctuality of a person who respected other people's time. She had changed from her work clothes into a clean blue dress, though she still wore practical boots and her hair was still pinned simply, and she looked entirely like herself, which Chester found he appreciated. He had already ordered coffee, and it was on the table when she sat down. She wrapped both hands around the cup, which told him she was either cold or she needed the steadying weight of something solid, and he was not sure which. "How is the herd?" she asked directly. "I haven't finished my assessment," he said. "But I noticed some respiratory signs in several animals. Do you know the herd?" She looked at him steadily. "I used to be their veterinarian." He let the weight of that settle. "Used to be." "Mr. Hollies has decided I am no longer suitable," she said, with the careful flatness of someone choosing each word deliberately to prevent the emotion underneath from coloring them. "He and several other members of the Cattlemen's Association have made it difficult for ranchers in the county to hire me." Chester looked at his coffee, then at her. "Why?" "Because one of his political associates wanted to be told that his horses were healthy, and I would not tell him that." She said it simply, the way you state a fact that is also deeply painful. The horses were not healthy. One of them died. And men like Bernard Hollies and Wendell Hare do not accept the idea that their problems might be their own responsibility. "They blamed you," Chester said. "They found the shape of a blame that fit their needs," she said. and they have enough influence in this county to make that shape stick." Chester looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window of Donahue's, a pair of riders moved slowly down the dusty street, and the spring sunlight fell at an angle that put a stripe of gold across the table between them. "I need to ask you something," he said, and his voice was even and direct. "And you can tell me if it's none of my business, but I'd rather ask than pretend I don't know there's a question." She nodded once. "The animals in the Hollies herd that are showing respiratory signs," he said. "How serious do you believe it is from what you know of the herd?" She looked at him for a long moment with those clear gray eyes. He had the sense that she was deciding something. Then she said, "If it's what I suspect, which is a bovine respiratory illness that was present in a lower grade form last autumn when I still had access to the herd, then left untreated it will spread. It could take a third of his herd within 2 months, possibly more. What's the treatment? Isolation of the affected animals, a specific herbal preparation for the early cases, rest, clean water, and careful management of the barn conditions, which are too humid on the north side." She paused. "I tried to tell him last autumn. He dismissed me. Brought in Dr. Pratt from Denver, who told him the animals were fine. I expect Dr. Pratt will tell him the same thing again now." Chester said nothing for a moment. He was not a man who rushed his thoughts. Outside, a dog barked twice and then went quiet. "Miss Merriweather," he said, "would you be willing to write up your assessment? Formally, as if it were a professional document. What you see, what you believe the condition is, what the treatment should be, what the timeline is if untreated." She looked at him with something that was cautious and curious at the same time. "What would you do with it?" "My assessment is a formal document," he said. "The commission requires me to note any conditions that represent a material risk to the value of the collateral. If a third of a herd is at risk of a respiratory illness, that's a material condition. I'm required to document it, and I'm required to document the source of my professional information." Something shifted in her face. It was not a large shift, but Chester saw it clearly. It was the particular expression of a person who has been fighting alone for a while and has just been told unexpectedly that someone else is willing to stand next to them. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's my job to document the truth," he said. "And because I don't believe in pretending a thing is healthy when it isn't." He paused. "And because from everything I've seen in the last 24 hours, you clearly know more about the animals in this county than anyone else, and that seems like information the animals deserve to benefit from." It was not a declaration. It was not a dramatic speech. He said it simply, plainly, like a man who had thought it through and arrived at the honest answer. Grace looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I'll write it up tonight." She brought the document to the hotel the following morning. Chester was already at his table with his own papers and coffee, and she sat across from him while he read what she had written. It was 6 pages in a clear, precise hand, documenting the progression of the respiratory illness, the specific indicators she had observed, the likely cause, the treatment protocol, and the projected timeline of deterioration if no action was taken. It was, in Chester's professional judgment, one of the most thorough and competent veterinary assessments he had ever read, including those by men with far more formal credentials. He looked up when he finished reading. She was watching him with the careful patience of someone who has learned to wait for judgments without flinching. "This is exceptional work," he said. "Thank you," she said. She received it without false modesty and without excessive pleasure, just a quiet acknowledgement of something she already knew to be true. "I'm going to visit the herd again this afternoon," he said. "Would you be willing to come with me?" She went very still. "Bernard Hollies will not allow me on his land. I am a commission assessor," Chester said. "I have the right to bring an expert consultant to assist with my assessment. That is a legal provision of my role. Hollies cannot deny me a consultant." "He will be angry," she said. "Yes," Chester agreed. "He will be." He looked at her. "But the question is whether that matters more than the truth." She looked back at him. Something in the quality of that look shifted from wariness toward something else, something that was not yet trust but was the beginning of trusting. "What time?" she said. They rode to the Hollies ranch at 2 in the afternoon, side by side on the wide, rutted road that ran north through the valley. The mountains were clear and cold-looking to the west, streaked with the last of the winter's snow. The grass in the valley was coming green in patches. Chester had not told Hollies he was bringing anyone. He simply arrived with Grace at his side. Bernard Hollies came out of the main house when he heard horses in the yard. He was a man who liked to meet things on his own terms, and he met them now with his thumbs in his belt and a look of deliberate authority on his face. That look went through several visible changes in rapid succession when he saw who was beside Chester. "What is she doing here?" He did not use her name. He said "she" with the particular disdain of a man who believes that disrespect can be made grammatically clean. "Miss Merriweather is serving as my expert consultant on this assessment," Chester said, with the same pleasantness he used for everything. "The commission allows for expert consultants. She has the most comprehensive knowledge of your herd's history available, so she's the appropriate choice." Hollies' face had gone the particular shade of red that lived between anger and embarrassment. "I will not have her on my land." "Then you will have me telling the commission that I was denied full access to relevant expertise," Chester said, still pleasant, still even, "which will delay the finalization of your loan assessment indefinitely. The commission takes a dim view of interference with authorized assessments." There was a silence. Somewhere in the barn a horse made a soft sound. The spring wind moved across the yard. Hollies looked at Chester with the flat, hard look of a man who is calculating rather than feeling, and then he stepped back from the door and walked away without another word. Chester and Grace exchanged a glance. It lasted only a second, and neither of them said anything, but it was the first moment that contained something beyond the professional, something that acknowledged they were in this together, whatever this was. They spent 3 hours at the Hollies ranch that afternoon. Doug Earl, the foreman, showed them the herd with the quiet competence of a man who actually knew and cared about the animals and was, Chester noted, clearly pleased to see Grace, even if he was careful not to show it in front of the men watching. Grace moved through the herd with a methodical focus that Chester found extraordinary to watch. She examined animals with her hands and eyes, and the particular kind of attentiveness that is only possible when someone has been paying attention to something for years. She spoke quietly to Chester as she went, noting what she found, and he took his own notes alongside hers. By the end of the 3 hours, she had identified 14 animals in early stages of the respiratory illness, 3 in moderate stages, and 1 that was already seriously compromised. "That one there needs to be separated today," she said quietly to Chester, nodding at a large steer in the east corner of the main barn. "Not tomorrow, today. If he's in with the others tonight, he'll spread the illness to every animal within 20 feet. Chester passed this to Doug Earl, who gave him a direct look and said, "I've been saying the same thing for 2 weeks. Nobody listened." On the ride back to town that evening, the light was going golden and long across the valley floor, catching the dust they raised and making it shimmer. They had been quiet for a mile, each processing the afternoon in their own way, when Chester said, "I want to ask you something that's not related to the work." She looked at him from under her hat brim. The evening light caught the auburn in her hair. "How long have you been fighting this by yourself?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily under them and the road curved west where the first pines began. "Since I got here," she said finally. "It's been quieter sometimes and louder others. The last month has been the loudest." "Do you have anyone in your corner here?" he said. She considered this honestly. "Hank Dubrow, a few of the homesteaders, Mrs. Clara Voss, who runs the church school and has been kind to me since I arrived." She paused. "But none of them have the kind of influence that would matter against Hollies." "Why didn't you leave?" he said. It was not a challenge. It was genuine curiosity. She turned and looked at him directly, and the expression on her face was one that he found himself wanting to study for a long time. It was complex and clear at once, the way certain landscapes are complex and clear, mountains that look simple from a distance and reveal their true texture only when you are standing in them. "Because leaving would mean agreeing that I did not deserve to be here," she said. "And I do not agree with that." Chester looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised them both, because it was more personal than anything he had intended to say on a 2-week work trip to a town he barely knew. "I have never," he said, "seen anyone more fit for the work they do than you are." She looked at him. Something moved across her face that she could not quite control, a flash of something unguarded, and she turned and looked at the road ahead before it could become fully readable. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was slightly lower than it had been. They rode the rest of the way back to town in a silence that was no longer the silence of strangers. Chester's formal assessment, when it was filed 6 days later, was a document that Bernard Hollies did not expect. It noted the respiratory illness accurately and completely, cited Grace's written assessment as an expert reference, and concluded that the loan value of the collateral was significantly reduced by the health risk to the herd pending treatment. It did not call anyone corrupt. It did not accuse anyone of bad faith. It simply documented the truth in the plain and precise language of a professional assessment, and that truth was damning in the quiet way that real truths tend to be. Hollies sent a letter to the commission within 2 days, questioning Chester's impartiality and suggesting that his use of an unfit practitioner as a consultant was grounds for the assessment to be invalidated. The commission's response came back 10 days later. It stated that Chester Crawford's methodology was within all professional guidelines, that the choice of expert consultant was within his authorized discretion, and that the assessment stood as filed. Chester showed Grace the response on the morning it arrived. They had been meeting for coffee at Donahue's every morning for the past week and a half, which had started as professional discussions about the assessment and had gradually, naturally, without either of them quite deciding to make it happen, become something they both arrived at a few minutes early for. She read the commission's letter carefully. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way he had not seen before. "They rejected his challenge," she said. "They did. He called me an unfit practitioner in his letter to the commission," she said. The words sat between them, visible and sharp. "He did," Chester said. "The commission disagreed." He paused. "For what it's worth, when I wrote the letter recommending your work to the commission's review board, I told them I had never encountered a more fit practitioner in my career." She went still. She was looking at him with an expression that he had not yet learned to fully read, though he was learning, day by day. It was something vulnerable and composed at once, the face of someone who has been told an important true thing and is deciding whether to let themselves fully receive it. "You wrote to the review board," she said. "It seemed appropriate," he said. "Accurate recommendations are part of my job." She was quiet for a moment. Outside Donahue's window, a wagon rolled by and a child called something to another child, and the normal sounds of the morning went on around them. Then she said, "Why do you care so much about this? About what happens to me, to my practice here?" It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, looking straight at him. Chester had noticed that Grace Merriweather did not ask oblique questions. She did not circle around the thing she actually wanted to know. He found that quality something close to wonderful. He was quiet for a moment, because the answer was accurate and he wanted to give it accurately. "Partly because it's the right thing," he said. "Partly because the work you do matters, and it matters to real living things that can't speak for themselves in any hearing." He paused. "And partly because somewhere in the last 10 days, I've started finding it difficult to think about leaving Dusty Creek, and I'd like to understand what that means before I do." The silence after that was different from the silences before. It had a quality of presence to it. Grace set her coffee cup down and looked at the table for a moment, and then she looked up at him, and there was something in her face now that was open in a way it had not been before. "I've never met a man," she said carefully, who heard the word unfit applied to me and responded by using it as evidence for the opposite argument. It was exactly that, he said. The argument that they wanted to call unfit was, in my professional assessment, one of the most thoroughly fit things I had encountered. It seemed worth saying. She looked at him for a long time. Then something happened in her expression that was quiet but clear, like a door that has been latched opening slowly inward. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no grand gestures. It was simply two people in the morning light in a small restaurant in a mountain town recognizing each other. "Would you like to come for supper?" she said. "I cook well. Another thing I've been told is unfit for a woman with professional ambitions." "I would like that very much," Chester said. He came to supper that Thursday evening, and she cooked a venison stew with root vegetables and fresh bread, and the meal was excellent, as she had promised. They talked for 3 hours at her kitchen table, the lamp between them making a warm circle against the dark outside the windows, and the conversation moved from professional things to personal things in a way that felt completely natural. He told her about his years on the cattle drives, the distances he had covered, the way the Texas plains looked at dawn when you were riding through them. He told her about his parents, his father who had been a cattle rancher in New Mexico, and his mother who had taught herself to read late in life, and had read everything she could find after that. He told her he had been engaged once, when he was 26, to a woman named Margaret in Santa Fe, and that Margaret had eventually married a shopkeeper because Chester was never in one place long enough to build anything with. Grace told him about her father in Pennsylvania and the medical journals she had grown up with. She told him about the Colorado Agricultural College and the particular difficulty of being the only woman in most of her classes, and about a professor named Dr. James who had told her in her second year that she was wasting her talent on animals when she was clearly smart enough for human medicine. She had thanked him and continued with her path, because she believed that the decision about what to do with one's talent belonged to the person who had it, not the person observing it. She told him about arriving in Dusty Creek and the complicated, slow process of earning trust, and about the ways in which that trust had then been used as a weapon against her when certain men decided it was inconvenient. By the end of the evening, the lamp had burned low and the stew pot was empty, and there was a quality to the air between them that was warm and particular. The quality of two people who have moved from being strangers to being something that does not yet have a name but is clearly real. At the door he put on his hat and said, "Thank you for supper." "Thank you for the commission letter," she said. They stood for a moment in the doorway, the night air coming in, the stars very clear above the mountain dark. Then he said, "Can I call on you again? Not in the professional capacity." She looked at him with that direct gray gaze, and the particular composure of her face had softened by degrees over the course of the evening into something more personal and more warm. "Yes," she said, "you can." April turned into May, and Chester found reasons to extend his stay in Dusty Creek beyond the completion of his assessment. He had other assessments scheduled further north, in the rangelands near Grand Junction, but he wrote to the commission explaining that a complicating health situation in the Hollies herd required monitoring and follow-up, which was true, and asked for a 2-week extension, which they granted. He knew, with the clarity of a man who does not lie to himself, that the herd monitoring was not the only reason he was staying. He and Grace fell into a rhythm that was natural and comfortable, and as the days went on, increasingly charged with something they were both aware of, and neither was rushing. They rode together on Sunday mornings, covering the long open valley with their horses at an easy canter, talking or sometimes not talking, the mountains enormous and clear to the west. They had supper twice a week, alternating between her kitchen and the restaurant at the hotel. He accompanied her on calls when she allowed it, which was most of them, and he watched her work with an attention that was partly professional admiration and increasingly something more. He found that he wanted to know everything about her. Not in the scattered, half-attentive way of casual acquaintance, but in the deep, specific way of someone who has recognized that a particular person is important and wants to understand exactly who they are. He wanted to know how she made her decisions and what she read and what she thought about when she was quiet. He wanted to know what made her laugh, which was harder to earn than a smile, but when it came, was generous and real. He learned that she laughed at absurdity, particularly when it was unintentional. He learned that she was never casual about the things she cared about. He learned that she had a particular affection for the homesteaders on the valley's edge, the small struggling families with their few animals and their enormous hope, and that she often saw them at reduced rates or no charge when she knew they could not pay. He learned that she carried her father's death quietly, but that it had never fully settled. He learned that she had been in love once before she came west, with a young doctor in Pennsylvania named Peter, who had eventually told her that he could not make a life with a woman who had no interest in becoming something quieter. She had told Chester this one evening on the porch of her house, with the matter-of-factness of someone who has fully processed the thing and put it in its right place, but he had heard the old weight in it anyway, and had felt an anger toward this unnamed Peter that surprised him with its sharpness. One afternoon in the middle of May, they were returning from a call at the Voss farm when their horses spooked simultaneously at a rattlesnake crossing the road. Coppice, Grace's mare, shied hard to the left and Grace stayed on her with the automatic ease of a skilled rider, but the sudden movement brought them close together on the narrow road, her horse almost alongside his, and for a moment they were very near each other. He put his hand on her horse's bridle briefly to steady the animal, and his other hand went to Grace's arm without thought, just the instinct of a person reaching toward a person they need to be sure is safe. She looked at him. He looked at her. The snake had long since gone into the grass, and their horses had calmed, and there was no practical reason for his hand to still be on her arm. Neither of them moved. The afternoon was golden and warm, and the birds were loud in the pines. "Chester," she said, and his name in her voice was something he wanted to hear again immediately. "I know," he said. It was not a dramatic statement, but it contained something that both of them had been building toward without quite stating for the past 3 weeks, and they both knew what it held. They sat their horses there in the afternoon road, and Chester said, with the directness that she had first used on him, and that he had adopted because it was the right language for a woman who deserved honesty, "Grace, I am in the process of falling in love with you. I want you to know that I know that." She was very still on her horse. The mare shifted weight underneath her and the leather creaked. A cloud moved across the sun and then away. "I am in the same process," she said, "and I find it considerably more alarming than anything else I've dealt with this year." He laughed, which startled the birds out of the nearest pine. It was a real laugh, unguarded. She looked at him with an expression that was startled and pleased, and then she laughed too, and the sound of it went out across the empty valley road, and the afternoon held it for a moment before the ordinary sounds of the world came back. They rode home side by side, and when they reached her gate he helped her down from her horse in the way that was customary, but he held her hands a moment longer than customary, and she did not pull them away. The situation with the Cattlemen's Association did not resolve itself gracefully. Men like Bernard Hollies very rarely permitted themselves graceful resolutions because grace in retreat required the admission of error, and they had built too much of their identity on never being wrong. What happened instead was a slow and grudging shift of the ground beneath the conflict. Chester's commission assessment, with its documentation of the respiratory illness and its citation of Grace's work, had been shared as part of the standard process with the territorial banking offices that were considering Hollies' loan. The bank's representative, a careful man named Mr. Aldis from Denver who had no personal investment in Dusty Creek's social architecture, read the assessment and sent a letter to Hollies explaining that the loan would be conditional on the successful treatment of the herd's health condition, for which they would require a certified assessment by a qualified veterinary practitioner. Dr. Pratt from Denver was asked to provide this assessment. Doctor Pratt, who had not actually examined the herd with any rigor, and who knew that 14 animals were now visibly ill, and who was aware that his previous assessment had already been contradicted by Chester Crawford's formal filing, quietly declined the commission. There was no one else within 60 miles. Bernard Hollies arrived at Grace's practice on a Wednesday morning in the third week of May. He did not take off his hat and he did not apologize, but he stood in her doorway with the compact discomfort of a man who has swallowed something that disagreed with him and said, "The bank requires a veterinary assessment. I need you to do it." Grace looked at him steadily. She was holding a bottle of tincture she had just finished preparing, and she set it carefully on the shelf before she answered. "My professional rate," she said, "is 50 cents per head for the initial assessment and a quarter per head for follow-up visits. I require that all treatment recommendations be followed completely and without modification, and I require that the notice removing me from the county's legitimate practitioners be rescinded in writing by the association." Hollies went through several colors. "Now see here, those are my terms," she said. "They are reasonable terms for professional services. I am not charging you an anger tax, Mr. Hollies. I'm charging you my rate." Chester, who had come by that morning and was currently in Grace's garden doing nothing in particular and staying close, heard most of this through the open window. He remained where he was because this was Grace's moment and she did not need him to step in front of it. There was a long silence from Hollies. Then he said, in the compressed tone of a man paying a price he considers extortionate but cannot avoid, "Fine." The written rescission of the notice came 2 weeks later, signed by Bernard Hollies, Thomas Prout, and the association secretary, stating that the review of Miss Merriweather's professional standing had been completed and that no impediment to her practice had been found. It did not say they had been wrong, but it said they could find nothing to prove she had been, which in practical terms was what mattered. Grace showed Chester the letter that evening at her kitchen table. He read it and set it down and looked at her. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Like a person who won a fight they never should have had to fight," she said, "which is a kind of satisfaction that has a shadow in it." "That seems right," he said. "But mostly I feel relieved," she said. "And a little triumphant." She smiled, and it was a particular smile, the kind that acknowledged both the weight and the lightness of a moment. "And I feel that the animals in this county are going to be better cared for, which is the part that matters most." "It is the part that matters most," he agreed. "Though for what it's worth, I also find the part about you being recognized as what you are to matter a great deal." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them as it usually was, and the night outside was warm and full of the sounds of late May, the frogs from the creek, the last birds settling, the wind in the pines. He looked back at her, and there was nothing in his expression that was complicated or guarded. He was simply there, looking at her, in the particular way he had developed over the last weeks of looking at her, which was the way of someone who has found something important and is paying full attention to it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand and took hers and held it, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. It was the first week of June when Chester told her he had been asked to report to Grand Junction by the 15th. He told her on a Sunday morning, on their ride in the valley, sitting on a flat rock above the river where they sometimes stopped to let the horses drink. The water was high and fast from the mountain snowmelt, shining in the early sun. "The commission has been patient," he said. "I've used up all the legitimate reasons I can find for staying." She was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the river with her knees pulled up and her hat in her hands, and the morning light was in her hair and on her face, and he thought he had never in his life been so aware of a person's presence as he was of hers. "I know," she said. "I don't want to go," he said. "I know that too," she said. She was still looking at the river. Then she turned and looked at him. "What are you going to do about it?" He looked at her. He had been turning this over for the past week with the same methodical care he brought to everything important. He had made his assessment. He was confident in it. "I'm going to ask you to marry me," he said. When I've been back long enough and worked hard enough that the question doesn't seem like something I decided on a 2-week trip. I want to give it the time it deserves, so you know it's real and not just the feeling of a moment." She looked at him for a long time. The river ran fast and cold below them, and the first summer warmth was in the high mountain air. "How long?" she said. "I'll be in Grand Junction for 6 weeks," he said. "Then I'm scheduled for 2 assessments in New Mexico. By October I could be back." "That's 4 months," she said. "It is," he said. "I know that's long." She looked at him with the direct, honest expression that he had come to think of as the most Grace expression she had, the one that held nothing back and did not pretend. "I've waited longer for less," she said. "October is fine." He took her face in his hands gently, with the care he used for important things, and he kissed her. It was the first time they had kissed, and it was unhurried and warm, and it said everything that the previous weeks had been accumulating toward. When he drew back, she was looking at him with her eyes bright and a smile that was private and real. "October," she said again. He left on a Monday with his saddlebags packed and his buckskin shoes fresh from Hank Dubrow's work. Grace stood at the edge of town to see him off, which was not something she had made into a production. She was simply there where he could see her, and he looked back once when he reached the bend in the road, and she lifted her hand, and he rode on. The 4 months were not easy. They wrote letters, long, careful ones, because both of them brought to letters the same quality they brought to everything else: specificity and honesty and attention. Chester's letters described the rangelands of western Colorado and the high desert of New Mexico with the eye of a man who had learned to see landscapes in detail. And they described his daily work and the animals he encountered, and increasingly, plainly, without decoration, his feelings for her. Grace's letters described her work, the cases she found interesting, the homesteaders whose animals she saved, the slow restoration of her practice's reputation now that the Cattlemen's Association's notice had been rescinded. Several of the ranchers who had left came back. Cal Whitmore was the first. He came to her door with his hat in his hands and said, "I should have stayed," and she said, "I know, Cal. Let me look at those heifers," and that was that. Her letters also described, in the careful language of a person unused to writing about personal things but learning, what she thought about at the end of the day and what she looked forward to. She did not say she missed him in the first letter, but she said it in the second, and having said it once she seemed to find it easier to say it plainly in every one after. Chester wrote back that he missed her in a way that had gotten into his daily life, the way cold gets into a barn in winter, finding every gap and making itself known. He arrived back in Dusty Creek on the 4th of October, 1882. She was at her practice when she heard his horse in the road, because she had learned the particular sound of that buckskin's long, easy stride, and she came to the door and he was already dismounting, tying the horse to her fence post with the casual ease of a man tying a horse to a fence post he intends to use regularly. He looked up and she was in the doorway. "You came back," she said. "I said October," he said. She came down the step and he crossed the distance between them and took her in his arms, and she put her arms around him, and they stood there for a moment in the October morning, the mountains cold and clear to the west, the last of the leaves turning gold on the cottonwoods along the creek. He drew back enough to look at her. "Grace," he said. "Yes," she said. She said it before the question was out because she had known what her answer was since June, and she did not see the point of making him wait for it. He laughed again, that real unguarded laugh that she had decided was one of her favorite sounds. "I haven't asked yet." "Then ask," she said. He took her hands. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said again, and this time it was a full and clear and joyful word, and she looked at him with the expression he had been carrying in his mind for 4 months in the rangelands and the desert, the one that was open and warm and entirely her own. They announced their engagement that evening at Donahue's, where they went for supper, and Hank Dubrow was there, and Clara Voss was there, and Cal Whitmore was there with his wife, and there was the kind of warmth in the room that happens in small towns when something genuinely good occurs. Even Doug Earl came in from the Hollies ranch, having apparently heard the news with frontier speed, and shook Chester's hand with sincere pleasure and said to Grace, "You deserve something good, Miss Merriweather," and Grace said, "Thank you, Doug," and meant it. Bernard Hollies was not there. Nobody expected him to be. Wendell Hare, who had been elected to the state legislature and had largely removed himself to Denver, sent no word. This absence was noted by nobody and mourned by nobody. Grace and Chester were married in November of 1882 in the small church with the crooked steeple, on a Saturday when the first hard frost had come, and the sky was the particular blue that Colorado produces in winter, sharp and deep and very clear. Clara Voss played the small church organ. Hank Dubrow gave Grace away, having appointed himself to this task with such decisive warmth that neither Grace nor Chester had thought to suggest another arrangement. Cal Whitmore and his wife sat in the front pew with their children, scrubbed and quiet. The homesteaders whose animals Grace had saved, the small scattered families from the valley's edges, came in their best clothes and filled the church with the particular warmth of people who are genuinely glad. Grace wore a dress she had made herself, a deep blue wool that matched the sky, with her father's pocket watch pinned at her collar, because she was not the kind of woman who left her most important people behind on the important days. Chester, in the front of the church, watching her come down the aisle on Hank Dubrow's arm, thought that he had traveled a great deal of the Western territories and had seen beautiful things in abundance, but he had never seen anything that made him feel the way he felt watching Grace Merriweather walk toward him. She was straight-backed and calm, and she was looking directly at him with those clear gray eyes, and she was smiling the private real smile that was only for him, and he thought that the best decisions he had made in his life had led him, through a series of roads he could not have planned, to this particular church in this particular mountain town on this particular frozen November morning. He took her hand when she reached him and held it in both of his, and the preacher began, and outside the wind moved through the empty cottonwoods along the creek, and the mountains stood in their enormous and indifferent and beautiful way, as they had stood for all of human time. Chester had already, in the weeks before the wedding, spoken to the commission about taking a regional position based in the Dusty Creek area, covering the southern Colorado ranges. The commission had agreed, partly because Chester's assessments were excellent and they wanted to keep him, and partly because the Hollies loan situation had demonstrated the value of having a thorough assessor anchored in a region rather than passing through it. It meant he would have to travel, sometimes for a week or two at a stretch, but he would always be coming back to the same place. The same place was Grace. They settled into married life with the ease of two people who had known each other well before they committed to knowing each other completely. Chester moved into Grace's house beside the practice, which was larger than his hotel room in ways that mattered, and which smelled of the herbs she grew, and the wood smoke from the kitchen stove, and he thought of the specific quality of a home built by someone who lives thoughtfully. He was useful to her practice in ways neither of them had anticipated before the marriage. His assessments frequently brought him information about the health of herds across the region, and when he identified concerns, he could refer ranchers to Grace directly. His reputation with the commission lent a kind of external credibility to her referrals that frustrated him, because her own credibility should have been sufficient, but he was practical enough to use the tools available. She was useful to his work in ways that were equally practical. Her knowledge of animal health meant she could often look at his notes and identify things he had recorded without fully recognizing their significance, and more than once she had, over supper, said something like, "That cluster of symptoms in the northwest pasture suggests the water source is compromised," and been right. They worked in this way, as a pair of things that fit together at the edges rather than one being absorbed into the other, which was, Grace privately believed, the only way two people like them could have worked. She also loved him with a depth and specificity that occasionally surprised her, not the fact of it, which she had seen coming since June, but the particular quality of it. It was not the consuming, disorienting love of a person who has lost themselves in another. It was the steady, deeply rooted love of a person who has been found, who has found, and who intends to stay. It had the quality of the best parts of her work, precise, attentive, committed to the genuine health of the thing it tended. He loved her with an equivalent depth. He showed it in the particular ways of a man who is not extravagant with language but is extravagant with attention. He noticed things. He noticed when she was tired before she said it. He noticed when a case had been hard and sat with her through the unwinding of it. He noticed the small, specific pleasures she had, a particular kind of mountain light, a good cup of coffee, the moment when an animal began to improve, and he arranged where he could for these things to happen. In the spring of 1883, 4 months after their wedding, Grace told him she was expecting their first child. He received this news sitting at the kitchen table with his morning coffee, and he went very still for a moment in the way he did with important things, processing it completely before he responded. Then he put the coffee cup down and said, "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "Tired, but well." He stood up from the table and came around to where she was standing and held her face in both his hands the way he had done the first time he kissed her, with the gentleness of someone handling an important and irreplaceable thing, and he looked at her for a long time without speaking. "I am," he said finally, "extraordinarily happy about this." She laughed and put her hands over his. "So am I," she said, "even though I have approximately 12 concerns about the timing and the logistics." "Tell me all 12, he said. "We'll work through them." They did over the course of the morning and several mornings after. Grace's concerns were practical and specific, and Chester addressed them practically and specifically. She intended to continue working through most of her pregnancy because she was healthy and capable, and the animals in the county still needed her. He agreed and said he would arrange his travel schedule to be as close to home as possible in the later months. She said she did not want the birth to happen without Clara Voss present, because Clara was experienced with births and was someone she trusted. He said they would speak to Clara that week. The child was born in November of 1883, exactly 1 year after their wedding, which Grace noted with the slightly amused satisfaction of a woman who appreciates when timing turns out to be poetic. He was a boy. They named him Jonas, for Grace's father, which was Chester's suggestion, offered one evening when she had been talking about her father with the quiet ache she sometimes allowed herself. She had looked at Chester when he said the name, and the look contained everything it needed to. Jonas Crawford came into the world on a cold November morning in the bedroom of the house on the east side of Dusty Creek, with Clara Voss in attendance and Chester in the adjacent room, having been placed there by Clara with the firm authority of a woman who has managed many nervous husbands. When Clara opened the door and told him he had a son, Chester went into the bedroom and found Grace propped against the pillows with a child in her arms, exhausted and bright-eyed and more herself than he had ever seen her, if that was possible. She looked up when he came in, and her expression was one he had never seen before on her face, though it was unmistakably hers, layered with something new that had entered her the moment Jonas did. Chester sat beside her and looked at his son, who was small and red and appeared displeased with all current arrangements. "He looks like he's already assessing the situation," Chester said. "He certainly is," Grace said. Chester looked at her. "How are you?" "Like I've done the hardest work of my life and am remarkably satisfied with the result," she said. She looked down at Jonas and then up at Chester. "He has your jaw, I think." "He has your expression," Chester said. "That look of complete certainty about everything." She laughed softly, so as not to wake the baby who had finally ceased his assessment and fallen asleep against her chest. Dusty Creek changed over the following years in the way that small western towns change in the late 19th century, slowly and then sometimes quickly. The railroad came through in 1885, not directly through Dusty Creek, but close enough, 12 miles to the east. that it altered the movement of cattle and goods and people in ways that reshuffled the county's economics. Bernard Hollies's cattle operation, which he had never quite managed to stabilize after the respiratory illness, changed hands in 1884 when Hollies sold his operation and moved to Denver, where he had connections to pursue other business interests. This departure was noted in the town with a range of reactions, from relief to indifference, none of it particularly dramatic. The land was purchased by a family from Kansas, the Bartlett family, who arrived with healthy cattle, practical methods, and absolutely no prejudice against women in professional practice. The Bartlett patriarch, a lean, serious man named Edward Bartlett, hired Grace for his herd within a week of arriving, shook her hand firmly, and said he had been told she was the best in the region. "You were told correctly," she said, and he laughed and said he liked a direct answer. Wendell Hare served one term in the state legislature, was not re-elected, and returned briefly to the area before moving on to other prospects. His name came up occasionally in conversations the way unsuccessful men's names sometimes do, briefly and without much heat, and then stopped coming up at all. Thomas Prout remained on his ranch and eventually, without the social pressure of Hollies and Hare, became a quiet client of Grace's. He never apologized and she never asked him to. They maintained a professional relationship that was adequate and correct. The homesteaders in the valley the families Grace had always cared about most expanded. New families arrived. The town grew modestly. Donahue's got a new stove. The church fixed its steeple. The livery expanded. Grace's practice grew. By 1885, she had more work than she could handle alone, and she took on an apprentice, a 20-year-old young man named William Foss, who had grown up on a farm near Pueblo and who had a genuine aptitude for animal medicine. She taught him with the same rigor her father had taught her, with the same patience and the same expectation of precision. Chester's commission work had taken on a more supervisory quality by 1885 as well, with younger assessors coming to him for training and guidance. He remained based in Dusty Creek and traveled the southern Colorado range, but his reputation had grown such that the commission consulted him on methodology questions from across the territories. He and Grace had been married 3 years in November of 1885, and they sat on the porch of their house on the evening of their anniversary with Jonah's, now almost 2, asleep inside, and the November sky above the mountains full of stars. 3 years, Chester said. 3 years, Grace agreed. She was leaning against him with her head on his shoulder, which was the posture she had developed over the years of their marriage for evenings on the porch. It was not a small gesture for Grace, who did not do anything that was not genuine, which made it mean something specific. "What do you think about?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I think about my father," she said. "I think he would have liked you." "I hope so," Chester said, "though I suspect I would have found him intimidating," she smiled. "He was, but in the way of people who are simply very certain of what matters." She paused. "I think he would have liked that you never once told me what I should be." Chester thought about this. "I never had any interest in telling you what you should be," he said. "You were already something remarkable. My only interest was in being close to it." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. The porch lamp made a small, warm circle against the dark. His face was familiar to her in the way that things you love with attention become familiar, not just recognizable but deeply known, every quality of it understood and valued. "I love you," she said. It was not a thing she said casually or automatically. When Grace said it, it was because the precise truth of it was requiring expression. "I love you," he said back, with the same weight. In the spring of 1886, Grace discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier in the early months and harder in the middle ones, and by July she had agreed with Chester's gentle, consistent suggestion that she reduce her caseload for a few months. William Foss handled the routine calls. Chester rearranged his travel schedule again, this time even more dramatically, keeping himself within a day's ride of home through September and October. Their daughter was born in October of 1886. They named her Eliza, a name that Grace had carried since childhood as one she intended for a daughter someday. She came into the world with an opinion about it, crying so vigorously and clearly that Clara Voss, who had attended the birth again, said she had never heard a more decisive baby. "She knows what she thinks," Clara said approvingly. Jonas, now nearly 3, met his sister with the solemn assessment of a small child determining what this new development meant for his existing arrangements. He eventually extended a careful hand and touched Eliza's cheek, and then looked up at his parents with an expression of tentative acceptance. "He'll be fine," Grace said. "He just needs time to process." Chester, looking at his daughter, felt the same deep, clear thing he had felt looking at Jonas, but with its own specific quality, the particular and irreplaceable love of a parent for a child that is always both general and entirely specific. "Hello, Eliza," he said softly, and his daughter, in her first days in the world, turned her face slightly toward his voice as if already sorting out who the important people were. The years after Eliza's birth settled into the rich, textured quality of a life that is genuinely good. It was not simple. There were difficult cases that troubled Grace for weeks, animals she lost that she had tried hard to save. There were assessment disputes that tested Chester's patience and professional standing. There were the ordinary difficulties of a household with 2 small children, the illnesses, the sleepless nights, the particular exhaustions of parenthood. But underneath all of it was the steady quality of what they had built together, the work they each did well and took seriously, the home they had made that was full of light and books and good food and children's voices, and the particular warmth of 2 people who chose each other not in a moment of weakness or circumstance, but with full knowledge of who they each were. Jonas grew into a boy who was quiet and observant and deeply interested in the natural world, which surprised no one who knew his parents. By the time he was 6, he was accompanying Grace on nearby calls with the serious concentration of a small person filing information for future use. Chester took him along on shorter trips with the buckskin, teaching him the things of the trail, how to read weather, how to manage a horse over difficult ground, how to navigate by the stars. Eliza was louder than her brother and had opinions on most things and expressed them clearly. She had, Clara Voss said, her mother's directness amplified, which Chester said he had not thought was possible. Grace found this characterization accurate and extremely pleasing. In the summer of 1887, when Jonas was 3.5 and Eliza was 9 months, Chester came home from a week's assessment trip to find Grace in the garden with both children. Jonas systematically examining the herb beds with a small notebook he had been given for this purpose, and Eliza sitting upright in a basket in the sun, holding a dried herb sprig and communicating her views about it to anyone who would listen. Chester stopped at the garden gate and looked at all of this for a moment. The late afternoon light was on the garden. The mountains were clear behind the house. Grace looked up and saw him, and her face did the thing it had done since they were first married when he came home after a trip, a quick, genuine brightening that she had stopped trying to compose into something more restrained because he always saw it anyway. He came through the gate and kissed her and picked up Eliza from her basket, and Eliza transferred her opinions about the herb sprig to her father immediately and at volume. "She has news," Grace said. "I can see that," Chester said. "Hello, my love." "She has been like this since this morning," Jonas said, without looking up from his notebook. "She found that dried lavender and she hasn't stopped." Chester laughed and sat in the garden with his daughter and his son and his wife, and the mountains behind them, and the late summer light in everything. And he thought that whatever roads had brought him here, however many dusty miles and unfamiliar towns and commission assessments and chance arrivals on chance Tuesday mornings, they had been precisely the right roads. By 1888, Grace's practice had a reputation that extended well beyond Dusty Creek. Ranchers from as far as 70 miles came to her for consultation on difficult cases. She had been asked to contribute to an agricultural journal published in Denver on the treatment of bovine respiratory illness, which she did in a careful, precise article that cited her field data from the Dusty Creek region and was received with considerable attention in veterinary circles. The article was published under her name, her full name, Grace Crawford, formerly Merriweather. She had sent a copy to the Colorado Agricultural College, where several professors had taught her. One of them, Dr. James, the one who had told her she was wasting her talent on animals, wrote back with a letter that she shared with Chester one evening. It was, in its way, a modest apology, saying that he was glad her path had taken her where it did, and that her work in the field had contributed meaningfully to the professional understanding of animal health in the territory. "That's not quite an apology," Chester said. "It's as close as men like him get," Grace said, "and it's enough." She set the letter aside and they went back to their supper, and Jonas told them about a beetle he had observed in the yard that afternoon, and Eliza had a strong opinion about the biscuits, and the lamp was warm between them and the mountains were dark outside the window, and Dusty Creek went on in the way it had always gone on, season by season, year by year. In the spring of 1889, Grace told Chester she was expecting a third child. He received this with the same still, complete attention he had given the previous announcements, and then said, "How do you feel?" "Happy," she said simply, "and tired, in exactly equal measure." "That seems right," he said. Their second son, Thomas, named for no one in particular but for the sound of the name which both of them liked, was born in November of 1889. He was a placid baby, which after Eliza seemed almost supernatural. He slept when he was supposed to sleep and ate when he was supposed to eat, and looked at the world with an untroubled contentment that Grace found both charming and slightly suspicious. "He's saving something up," she told Chester. "He's probably already assessed the situation and found it satisfactory," Chester said. "He gets that from you," she said. "He gets the contentment from you," he said. "The assessment is mine." Jonas, now 6, took his new brother's arrival with the equanimity of a boy who had established his place in the household's order, and was not threatened by additions. Eliza, who was 3, was fascinated by Thomas in the proprietary way of a child, who intends to be in charge of something. She took it upon herself to explain the household to him in the serious, detailed manner of one who has recently come into important information and must share it. The house on the east side of Dusty Creek had been expanded twice by this time. Chester had built the first addition himself, the winter after they married, adding a proper study with shelves for Grace's medical books and his commission documents. A local carpenter had built the second addition after Jonas was born, 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The garden had expanded too, through seasons of careful tending, and grew the herbs Grace used in her work alongside vegetables and flowers, because Grace believed, and Chester did not disagree, that beauty had a practical function in a life. The spring of 1890 brought Chester news that the commission was establishing a permanent regional office in Pueblo, and they wanted him to take the directorship. It was a significant promotion. It came with a salary that was considerably higher than his field assessor pay, a formal office and supervision of all assessments in the southern Colorado region. He brought the offer home and told Grace about it at supper after the children were in bed over coffee. He laid it out completely, the details, the salary, the implications. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "What do you want to do?" "That depends on what you want to do," he said. She looked at him. "I asked first," he smiled. "I want to take it," he said. "It's good work and it matters, but it means moving to Pueblo, and I won't do that without you wanting it too." She was quiet for a while, turning it over with the complete honesty she brought to everything important. "Pueblo is bigger," she said. "There would be more animals, more ranches." She paused. "More men who haven't heard of me yet who will need to form an opinion." "Yes," he said, "and when they do, their opinions will be the same as the ones here." She looked at him. "You're very certain about that?" "I watched you for 4 months in Dusty Creek before I had the sense to stay," he said. I have data." She laughed. He looked at her, as he had looked at her across tables and pastures and mountain roads for 8 years now, with the particular attention of a man who finds a person continuously worth looking at. "If we move," she said, "I want to keep the house here, come back in summers. The children know this place, and I don't want to be somewhere I can't come back to." "Agreed," he said immediately. "And I want a proper practice building in Pueblo," she said, "not a room attached to someone else's business." "A proper building, mine." "Also agreed," he said. "We'll make that part of the arrangement before we go." She looked at him with the expression he loved most, the one that was open and direct and held all of her in it. "Then yes," she said. "Let's go to Pueblo." They moved to Pueblo in August of 1890 with 3 children, 2 horses, a large number of medical books, Chester's commission papers, the contents of the herb garden transplanted carefully into boxes, and the trunk that had come with Grace from Pennsylvania 11 years before that still had her father's medical journals in it. Dusty Creek saw them off with the warmth of a small town that knows it is losing something good. Hank Dubrow shook Chester's hand and held it for a moment with both of his. Clara Voss embraced Grace with the particular fierceness of a woman who does not cry easily, but is choosing not to now. Cal Whitmore was there with his wife and his children, who were teenagers now. The Bartlett family came from what had been the Hollies Ranch. William Foss, Grace's apprentice, who was 29 now and a fully capable practitioner, was taking over her Dusty Creek practice. She had arranged this over the previous 6 months with the same care she arranged everything she cared about. "You'll do well," she told William. "I learned from the best," he said. She looked at him directly. "Yes, you did," she said, without false modesty, because she had indeed been excellent and there was no good reason to pretend otherwise. Pueblo was larger and faster than Dusty Creek and had all the complications of a larger and faster place. Chester established the Regional Commission office in a proper building on the main street in September of 1890, and within a month had a staff of 2 assistant assessors working under him. Grace's practice building was constructed and ready by October. It was a proper structure on the edge of the livestock district, with examination space and a dispensary and a small waiting area, and a sign above the door that said Grace Crawford, veterinary practitioner, in clean black letters on white. The first week was slow. Pueblo had its own established veterinary practitioners, 2 of them, both men, and the livestock community knew them and had its own inertia. Grace expected this. She had built a practice from nothing before. She knew how it went. She saw the first cases, the ones that people brought her when curiosity or desperation or recommendation overcame inertia. She did excellent work on every one of them, as she always did. The word moved. By spring of 1891 she had a full caseload. One of the established veterinarians in Pueblo, a man named Dr. Robert Haynes, who was 50 and experienced and had spent his life doing good work, came to call on her in the spring with the forthright manner of a professional colleague rather than a competitor. He had heard about her methods from a rancher he shared with her, and he had a case he wanted her opinion on, and he asked for it directly. She gave it directly. They became colleagues of genuine mutual respect, and eventually, over the years, something close to friends. Dr. Haynes had the quality of a man who had no investment in the idea that competence belonged to a specific kind of person. He simply recognized it where it existed. Grace found this quality, in any person, to be among the most valuable things a person could have. The children grew in Pueblo with the energetic contentment of children whose parents are happy. Jonas, who was 12 by 1895, had decided he was going to study medicine, which surprised no one. He went about this decision with the methodical certainty of a boy who has already assessed the situation. Eliza, at 9, had strong opinions about everything and an aptitude for numbers that was apparent to her teacher and quietly delighted Chester. Thomas, at 6, was still placid and contented, and also, it was becoming clear, possessed of an extraordinary gentleness with animals that made Grace watch him sometimes with the expression of someone seeing themselves in another person. "He'll probably follow you," Chester said one evening, watching Thomas in the backyard with a rabbit he had found with an injured leg and was nursing with careful patience. "I hope so," Grace said. "The work could use him." Chester looked at her. 36 years old, the lines of her face carrying the years that had been spent in weather and work and the full occupancy of life. And she was more beautiful to him now than she had ever been, because beauty in the way he experienced it had grown over the years to mean not the surface of a thing but the whole continuous quality of it, the character and intelligence and heart that had accumulated into who she was. She looked over and saw him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She gave him the expression, the warm, particular one. "You've been looking at me for 13 years. "I know," he said. "I keep finding new things worth looking at." She leaned over and kissed him, and outside the window the summer evening was warm and golden, and Thomas sat in the backyard talking very quietly to his injured rabbit, and somewhere in the house Eliza was making a considerable noise about something, and Jonas could be heard walking in his unhurried way from his room to the kitchen, and all of it was completely ordinary and completely perfect. The year 1895 came in cold and clear and good. Chester turned 44 that February, which he noted without much alarm. Grace was 40, which she examined with the same honest directness she brought to all assessments, and concluded that 40 felt like a person who has done a great deal and is well placed to do a great deal more. She had received, by this time, 2 formal recognitions of her professional contributions. The first was a citation from the Colorado Agricultural College, presented in 1893, acknowledging her contributions to the field of livestock health in the territorial period. The second was an invitation to speak at an agricultural conference in Denver in 1894, where she addressed an audience of 200 practitioners and ranchers on the early identification and treatment of bovine respiratory illness. She gave the talk in the same clear, precise, evidence-based manner she brought to everything. The audience was attentive. There were questions afterward, genuine professional questions, and she answered them all completely. Chester was in the audience. He had arranged his commission schedule specifically to be there. He sat in the 4th row and watched his wife speak with the quiet, immovable pride of a man who has never once doubted what she was capable of, and finds it deeply satisfying when the world arrives, at last, at the same conclusion. Afterward, in the evening at the hotel in Denver, she sat on the edge of the bed with her shoes off and the pins out of her hair, which she still wore auburn though there were silver threads in it now that she had not troubled to obscure. "How did it feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly, as she always did. "Like standing somewhere I always should have been," she said, "and like it took too long to get there, both at once." "Both of those things are true," he said. "Yes," she said, "they are." She looked at her hands in her lap, the hands that had been doing good work for 20 years in the rangelands of Colorado, and then she looked up at him. "I'm glad you were there." "I wasn't going to miss it," he said simply. She smiled. "I know," she said. "That's one of the things I love most about you." In the summer of 1897, Jonas graduated from his preparatory studies and began his medical coursework at a college in Denver. He left in September with the quiet purposefulness of a young man who has known what he intended for a long time and is now doing it. Grace packed his trunk with the same care she packed everything important, and Chester rode with him to the railway station at Pueblo and saw him onto the train. On the platform, Chester shook his son's hand, and Jonas, who was 16 and had his mother's gray eyes and his father's steady way of standing, looked at him with the particular directness of a child who has grown up in a household where honest expression was the standard. "Take care of Mother," Jonas said. "Always," Chester said. "Take care of yourself." "Always," Jonas said, and smiled and got on the train. The platform was empty and ordinary as trains always leave it, and Chester stood there for a moment in the early September sunshine and felt the particular feeling of a parent watching a child become themselves and finding it, despite everything, exactly right. By 1899, the century turning in its slow, enormous way, Dusty Creek was a small, bright memory, and Pueblo was fully home. Thomas, 12 years old, had become his mother's regular assistant on weekend calls, carrying her case with the serious concentration of a boy who intended to learn everything. Eliza, at 13, had decided she was going to be the first woman to sit on the Pueblo City Council, a goal she had announced at the supper table with the absolute certainty of someone who has assessed the situation and found no logical barrier. Chester had said, "I believe you," and Grace had said, "I will hold you to that," and Eliza had nodded in satisfaction and returned to her biscuits. It was in the autumn of 1899 that Chester came home from a week's supervisory trip to find Grace sitting at the kitchen table with a letter open in front of her. She was reading it with the particular stillness of someone who has read something important and is sitting with it before deciding what it means. He put his bag down and sat across from her. "What is it?" She looked up. Her eyes were bright in the way they sometimes were when something had moved her. "It's from William Foss," she said, "in Dusty Creek." "Is he well?" Chester said. "He's very well," she said. "He says the practice is thriving. He has an apprentice of his own now." She paused. "He says the Cattlemen's Association in Dusty Creek, which is now under entirely different leadership, has named the annual Livestock Health Award after me." Chester looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression that contained everything: the history of it, the years in Dusty Creek and the notice on the door, and the men who had wanted her to be smaller than she was. And then everything that had come after, the work done well and the life built fully. And the man across the table who had walked into her town one Tuesday morning on a buckskin horse and had never, not once in 17 years, looked at her as anything other than exactly what she was. "That's very well deserved," Chester said. "It's very unexpected," she said. "Those two things are not mutually exclusive," he said. She smiled. It was the private, real smile, the one that had been only for him since 1882, and it had not diminished or become automatic with the years. It was still specific and genuine, and it still did exactly what it had always done to him. "No," she said, "they are certainly not." She folded the letter carefully and set it with the other things she kept in the right-hand drawer of the kitchen desk: the letters from Jonah's in Denver, the photograph taken at their wedding, her father's pocket watch when it was not on her person, the specific small collection of the things that mattered most. Chester reached across the table and took her hand, as he had taken it the first time across another table in another kitchen 17 years before, and held it with the same warmth and intention. "To the end of the century," he said. "To the end of everything," she said, and meant all of it. The work and the years and the children and the mountains visible from every window they had ever shared, and most especially the man across the table who had seen her clearly and completely from the very beginning, and had never once suggested she be less. Outside the Pueblo house, the October evening settled over the streets and the foothills, and the first stars came out over Colorado, and in the kitchen the lamp burned warm between them, as it had always burned, and as it would burn on into the long good years still ahead.